Will be followed by remarks from, and then Susan, and then I'll moderate our discussion. So please help me welcome Inge, Susan, and Katherine to our little gathering today.
Hello. I was at Magnum for about 1.5 years when Ernst Haas suddenly arrived in New York. He was then in his early 20s, and he had spent the war years in Austria. And so, of course, he was kind of an enemy alien, but he'd taken up photography because with a Jewish grandmother, he wasn't allowed to study, become a doctor, or anything like that. And so he didn't know what to do with himself, but as a boy, he'd always scribbled pictures and given them to his parents as sort of love gift. So after the war, when conditions were absolutely terrible in Austria, he didn't know what to do with himself, but then he decided to become a photographer. His father had actually taken photography as kind of a love labor thing and taken a lot of pictures on his honeymoon. But of course, Ernst had forgotten about all that when he was about 18 years old. And so he took pictures of beautiful flowers and leaves around Vienna until he received a scholarship to go to Switzerland after the war. So as he got to Switzerland, Switzerland at that time was kind of well ahead in the magazine business. And there was one magazine called Do that was particularly wonderful. And he managed to get to see the editor of that magazine. And that editor showed him the pictures of a Swiss photographer who showed what was going on in Europe after the war. He wasn't taking pictures, pretty pictures of leaves and flowers the way Ernst was. And Ernst was absolutely amazed when he found that you could tell the human story with photography instead of just taking pictures, pretty pictures of flowers and leaves. And that was Werner Bischof. And they became firm friends. But so Ernst returned to Vienna and he started to take pictures of the misery around him. And then one time, he was going off for a fashion assignment. He'd just gotten, his work had just been published in a magazine in Germany. And he got off to see what the commotion was that he was seeing. And it turned out that they were the first Austrian prisoners of war arriving back from Russia. There was a big event. There was nothing about it in the newspapers. There weren't any names or anything. But anyway, Ernst got off and he started taking pictures. And he got very excited. And
Sir, it's not the mic is not picking up.
oh, okay. Is the mic doing better now?
There.
That's better.
I'm sorry. So he was taking pictures of the prisoners of war. And it was very moving for him and for everybody else. And he went back and kept on taking pictures over a period of time while these prisoners were returning. And there were scenes of mothers seeing their sons for the first time in years, and little children who'd never seen their fathers, and so on. And he sent these pictures off to that American subsidized magazine in Munich. And the editor got terribly excited and said that he was looking at the pictures of a genius and he never thought anything like that before. And he sent the pictures off to Robert Capa, who was in Paris and had just started Magnum about 1.5 years before. And Capa also got very excited and he wrote to or called up Ernst in Vienna and said, come on over here. So Ernst and his researcher, Inge Murat, who later married Arthur Miller, got on the train and went up to Paris. And met Capa, and Capa said to Ernst, join Magnum, which was an international independent photographers cooperative, which was very unusual at that time, because especially in American magazines, photographers had to leave the publication and choice of their pictures to picture editors who didn't have much of a say about their own work. So when these people, the pictures were published in England and they were published in America, and the picture editor at Life magazine, which was the leading magazine at the time, got very excited and tried to hire Ernst. They offered him a job as a photographer, which he refused with a letter which he loved to quote to everybody years later, which he said, no, he wanted to be a photographer on his own terms, and explore the world on his own terms, and he didn't want to take assignments. So, of course, Life didn't like being turned down like that, because it was very unusual to be offered a job at Life at all. Well, all this time, Ernst had wanted to come to America because he had a favorite uncle who went to live in the United States and who brought back stories of American Indians and headdresses with feathers on them that as a little boy, Ernst just loved. So he wanted very much to come to America. And it was always his dream to see American Indians, who in those days were always the people who were they weren't suppressed as they are in reality. In the stories, they were the heroes. So anyway, it took a long time for Ernst Haas to get a visa, because as an Austrian with an Austrian passport, he was a former enemy alien, and it was very difficult to get a visa. But finally, Capa had the bright idea to make him vice president of an American corporation, and that shoved the visa matter along, and Ernst arrived about 1951 in May in New York, and Capa had made him vice president of Magnum Corporation in New York Corporation. So Haas arrived in New York, and I had joined Magnum about a year and a half earlier, and I was in my 20s, and he was in his 20s, and I spoke German, and he spoke German. We became great friends and started working together. And Capa had told Ernst to teach me about photography, because, of course, I had come from the BBC, everything was words. So we got along quite well. And I would like to make a little break. Can we do that? Can we make a little pause, please? I want to drink something.
Let's have a drink.
Thank you. Well, Ernst had his own ideas of what a photographer should do, and those ideas did not include doing assignments for magazines, to try and find pictures for situations that somebody was making up when based on reality. And he started to go out, do stories on his own. And after about a year, he got his visa and he came to the United States. But actually, he had made friends with Mr. Steichen, who was the person who created the Family of Men, and Steichen had used Magnum Paris for his basis. So he already knew about Ernst Haas. And Ernst came and to New York, and for a long time, there weren't any assignments because he had offended Life magazine by turning down this offer of a staff job, and it was pretty tough for him. And in the meantime, while he was in Europe, he had met his first wife, Tonus, And so eventually he managed to get her a visa, and she had a little boy, and she came with her little boy, and finally he had a home. So Ernst did a lot of assignments for European magazines because that was what was needed. And when he was finished with those, he was near the American West, and he decided to go and look for Indians. And he found a girl who showed him the way, and he found himself out in the desert. And he was absolutely flummoxed by it because the light was so different from anything he had seen in the Austrian Alps during his summer vacations. And it was all so different. And he started taking pictures like mad. And eventually he created a story which he sent to New York and to Life magazine. And they were absolutely amazed because at that time, Europe was the fashion and everybody wanted pictures from Europe, and nobody was interested in pictures of what the United States looked like. So they made a layout of 6 pages, which was a big, big story in those days. But Ernst said, no, you can't have my pictures because you're not telling the story I want to tell. So they let him make his own layout, and they published it on 6 pages and called him a famous photographer. So now he had made an entrance to Life magazine, and he had some money finally because the page rates for 6 pages was quite a lot of money. So the question was what to do next. And he thought he would want to do the Grand Canyon in color, but Life didn't want that. And he met his old editor one day, and the editor said to him, but Ernst, why don't you know what you want to do when you were in Munich? You always told me you wanted to photograph New York in color. So at that time, there wasn't any color in the magazines. Everything was black and white. Every once in a while, Life magazine would publish a 6-page story in color, but it was never had any action, always buildings or something that didn't move because the photographers were using large cameras that use a large size film. Ernst, of course, was using a Rolleiflex and a Leica. So Ernst, this editor said to him, Ernst, you wanted to photograph New York in color. So Ernst went to Life and said, I want to do New York in color. And he started going around New York, and he started taking pictures. You're going to see the pictures afterwards. You're going to see a projection of some of the pictures. Life magazine published it on 12 pages, and then they published another edition on another 12 pages. And Ernst was very, very rich. And he was a little bit off his head with his new success. But in the meantime, his visa ran out. So he had to leave America, and his wife, the little boy, to leave America too. So in the meantime, Kappa thought that this was not a good idea for Ernst to have his head in the clouds all the time and think he would be able to live with doing stories on cities. And he got him an assignment in Indochina. That was the time of the Indochina War. And so Ernst got back to where he had 2 or 3 weeks left before going off to Indochina, and he started going around Paris, taking pictures of Paris. And the result was another great essay on Paris. And his color pictures were unlike other people's color pictures because, in a sense, they were more like paintings. It's a little bit hard to explain, but easy to see. So then Ernst went off to Indochina, and it was an entirely different story. He was absolutely overwhelmed by the number of people he saw there. And of course, he had never been an actor of fighting, but now he was covering all that sort of thing. But after a while, he thought he would pleasure himself, go and spend some time in Cambodia. And he wanted to go to Angkor Wat, which he did. And in those days, nobody went there. Now it's a great tourist attraction. and he was absolutely taken by I'm just taken by the pictures that appear on there. But that's New York, that's Times Square, and that's out of that great life essay that I was talking about. I'm going to show more.
It's playing on a loop, so it'll just keep looping as we talk. So you'll see all different kinds of photographs appear as you're talking.
Yeah, Ernst,
Yeah.
when he saw something unusual, he took a picture. Nobody was taking pictures. This was paint that was peeling off a wall somewhere in New York, and it was part of his New York essay. And it was an unusual thing because people only took pictures of people. We didn't publish that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, do you want me to jump in?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
You can jump in, but I couldn't resist this quote because as you're speaking and looking back through the book, and Ernst is right, these are the letters that Inge collected from Ernst over various times. It is also the greatest wish of every young photographer to work one day for life. There is no magazine with a greater understanding of picture story. I have now the difficult choice between my greatest wish and the realization of my oldest dream. And that's just segue. Studied Ernst through life, essentially through the magazine,
Right.
among other things.
But I first came to his work in the exhibit that Eduardo mentioned, which was thinking about the role of color photography. And part of what makes the pictures that are, have been on screen for the last few moments, and I think we have a few more still to come, part of what makes them particularly interesting and the fact that Life gave 12 pages one week and then another 12 pages another week gives them real importance is that at this time, color photographs were most often being deployed for advertising purposes, for products, for fashions, for anything but art photography. And I think one of the reasons that this two-part portfolio by Haas is so landmark is that it's this really decisive break and a very strong commitment on the part of Life to put at the forefront of their publication color photographs. So they'd been publishing color photographs pretty consistently around 1948, but these two portfolios in 1953 across the two weekly issues is really a kind of landmark statement. And they sort of never look back after that. And that's one of the reasons that I came to know Ernst's work was this really incredible achievement. He also is one of the first photographers to have his color photographs shown at MoMA. So there's also, in photo history, the received narrative is that like we all bow down to William Eggleston and like his pictures are amazing, but he's not the person who really kickstarts it. And in fact, one of the people who really kickstarts it on the printed page and in the hallowed halls of MoMA is Ernst Haas. And so that was really my first introduction. And it does weave into Life, but I was really interested, and maybe Susan, I'm going to then bring you in because the quote from Ernst that we published in that Color Rush project is him talking about this belief that color was the right that shooting color film was the right thing for this moment, that something that the war years and the immediate post-war years were black and white and gray, and it was time for the newness of color. And I think that one of the reasons I love that is and then the book also talks a lot about sort of this, because I never met him, unlike the two of you, but someone who's trying to figure out where black and white can do what work and what work color can do, and his mind separating those two and understanding them to function very differently, and all the experimenting he does with color that's so different than the black and white work.
I just found another quote. Can you hear me? 'Cause I can't- This is not loud. Doesn't seem to be. Is that all? Try it on.
Is that, yeah, great. So I just was, as Kate was saying that, I was looking for this quote. So this is Ernst. These are all from letters, fragments of letters that Ernst has written to us, or he's written to you in some cases. He's written them to various people. And so the important moment here is he's saying to talk about color photography is much more to the point, right? Here we must separate colored photography from color photography. The first is a summation of black and white subject plus color. The second, an equation in which the subject is color. As we had to create a consciousness for black and white photography representing color, we now have to try to create a color consciousness in itself. Black and white photography is generally suited for journalistic prose. Color photography, I feel, lends itself especially to expressing a visual kind of poetry. So what I find fantastic is he gets it, and he says it so well, and he's struggling to have other people understand it. I mean, Eggleston is something in between, in fact, for those of us. He says, without a descriptive caption to justify its existence, I would rather see it speaking for itself, less descriptive, more imaginative, less information, more suggestion, less prose, more poetry. So I think you see the range behind us. We're not doing this as a kind of PowerPoint lecture, but you see the difference of what Inge was describing when he's on assignment. This is Magic City. Do you want to talk about the tear sheets of?
These are screen grabs of the a few pages of the Life magazine 2-part portfolio. And I just thought it was important to not just see, I mean, there's photos in the book, and I love that, and letting them stand on their own, but also I thought important for people to see how it gets presented as a portfolio, and that it really is, quite remarkable that, you're seeing a full page of Life magazine. I don't know what the going rate would have been for an advertiser in those days, but let me tell you, that's valuable property. And a full page is being given over to this meditation on window reflection. Right? I mean, and I wanted to drive that home by also seeing the ways, and you brought up him thinking about his layouts very carefully. And so I also wanted everyone to have a chance to see these photographs all about New York City, but arranged so that they play off one another in terms of color, in terms of subject, in terms of texture sometimes. But I wanted you to get a feel for what that looked like on the page back in 1953.
And we could go in so many different
I
directions.
know. But Eduardo-
No,
Well,
but I mean, I think. Oh, did you want to say?
Please, Inge.
What?
Where did I leave off?
Well, you can respond to just what Kate was saying too, Inge. You could tell us about, there's a picture of you, in fact. That's you.
Oh, yeah,
So how
that's-
did you find the letters, Inge?
but that's not by Ernst. That's by
No.
Elliot Arwood.
Okay. How did you find the letters?
Hmm?
Where did you find the letters from Ernst? Maybe tell people so they get
Well,
excited
I
to
found the letters by Ernst after he was dead, and his children asked me to participate in a book that he had been commissioned to do on color, but he died before he finished it. So they were working on the book, and they wanted somebody to write about Ernst. And I had written about Ernst before, so they asked me to write the introduction, but actually I thought it would be better to use partly what I had to say about him and partly what he said himself.
Mhm.
So the book, which maybe if you're lucky, you still find it in some library. I divided the text into two parts. I wrote partly about Ernst, and I let Ernst speak for himself, which he did very well indeed.
I think we have copies here. I don't think they have to go to the library. They can look at a copy
Oh.
tonight.
Wonderful.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I was wondering if you had thought about this, Kate, and Susan too, but I mean, the passages that Susan quotes where he talks about the visual poetry, I mean, how these can be a kind of poetry. And he makes a distinction at one point in an interview that Inge does with him at one point. He's talking about the literariness of the visual, especially in film. And then he says that when he was doing photography, he tried to separate photography from that literariness, which seems a little strange because he also thinks of the photograph as poetic. And one of in the book, Inge talks about the way in which in the summer of '86, he's working on a documentary that he doesn't finish that is called Poetry in Photography. So there's a way in which he actually, especially when you see the images with the movement and everything, there's something that isn't straight documentary in a particular way. I mean, it is documenting something, but it's introducing movement and something visually poetic. Can you jive that with him saying that he didn't want to be working in movies because he thought that movies were more literary, and he liked that photographs could be both visual and still, and not poetic. Whereas, but he also seems to be interested in the poetry of the image. Right?
Yes. And of course, there was nobody who was doing photography at that time that was not related to a lot of action. Action was everything in the layouts of the magazines. But for him, it was also contemplation, which was totally different from action. And that's why he, for example, loved to take photographs of objects. And his famous picture was called Holy Underwear. And it was a pair of underpants lying in the street, New York street. And it looked like a crucifix. And people would never associate it except for the caption with that sort of thing. And he believed very much in taking your own dreams and turning them into photography.
Yeah.
Didn't have to have subject matter. Although subject matter could be very important, like on that picture, which is an early one from his very first picture story of Vienna after the war, where he shows the young man who looks so normal, and then you look again and you see that he's only got one leg, and that there's a wooden leg sticking out of his
backpack
camera, and that was very much of an Ernst Haas kind of turning the world around.
I mean, part of, Inge, what I love about what you found in Ernst's letters is the way in which anyone, any photographer today, and many of us all here, do you know, this is another fragment, do you know that I lead a double life? Really? Oh. That I do not photograph like a professional, that with the energy needed to force myself to do things, to earn a little money, with that energy, I could do other things that have not yet been done, experiments, right? New ways, all interconnections between different disciplines interest me, which goes back to your thinking or question about movies. He's looking, you know, for something beyond what the assignment offers him, even though he's very happy to travel and experience the world. And it's so, the poetry, you know, on the next page, he's writing to Kappa, within us, there must be something very silent, lonely, and shy, something we cannot see because it's so dark and still and so much filled with color, something we cannot hear because it is so silent and still. so much filled with sound. So this is right on the edge of trying to figure out how does photography lead him into another sensibility? You know, what else can he capture to convey?
I mean, what's so nice about the book is that it brings together these letters that are to Inge. I mean, there's exchanges, but also to Kappa, to other photographers. But there is this meditation on the medium
Mhm.
that he engages within the letters. And so when you have, I mean, we all have like quotes written down that we want to read.
Yeah.
But I think that what's nice is to put them together along with the images as she does in the book, and then also to intersperse it with her account, which she gave us a little taste of today, account of the life.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we were talking about before was just how you write a life on the basis of letters, right? And how I mean, that's something that also extremely interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Of course, I knew him very well,
Yes.
so it wasn't just
It
writing
wasn't just the letters.
letters. No, but which was also knowing when the letters hit it on the head, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're interweaving stories and your memories of what was going on in his life in and around the letters. So it's the letters and your stories about what was happening that led to a particular letter, which is very important for the reader.
It helps contextualize the images.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's part of how you contextualize the image.
What else did you want to read? I'm curious
I have
what
one that I
stood
really
out.
want to
I
read.
mean, I think you should
think this is
hear the
amazing.
writing because the writing
It is
gives you a
amazing
feeling.
passage, I think. And there's so much that one can, I think, do with it. But it says he's talking about the temporality of a photograph and also about the relationship between the photograph and movement. Is a moment does not have an absolute time length and can be stretched. The appearance of the picture will then not depend only on the shutter speed, but on the movement of the camera in relation to the movement of the subject. Purely seen, one image is swallowed by the next. We can, in photography, speak of an accumulation of moments on top of each other. What I'm after is the choreography of the subject within time and space, projected on a two-dimensional surface. The instant moment has the truth of a fact. It is perspectively correct. In motion photography, this is no longer true. The interpretation is of a much more poetic nature. Time and space are unthinkable without each other, and so the liberty in time becomes identical with the liberty in space. This is a gorgeous passage. It is really gorgeous.
One of my favorites.
And you know, this thing about how a moment can be stretched and you have these moments that are accumulated one on top of the other means that at any given moment when you're looking at a photograph, especially with a photograph that includes motion within it, you have different moments within that surface so that the image captures not just a moment, but a kind of archive of moments in that sequence. I mean, it's really beautiful. I think this passage I really like.
And then the practitioner in me feels that you should hear the next paragraph because he says, you know, I work by moving my whole body and not only my head and hands. I don't use a tripod so I can be flexible. I study the movements until I feel in tune with them so I can control and decide what to do during the time length of the shutter opening.
Yeah.
Now you're all making pictures with iPhones just like that, right? Every day, you know, you're moving with your camera, but you're not thinking about that notion of time in the way he's capturing it here.
Yeah.
What's your favorite paragraph?
Well, I had a question for Inge that isn't a paragraph. Forgive me.
Yeah.
But you said that when he gets this vice presidency, one of his primary jobs is to teach you photography. And I wanted to hear about what that looked like. How did he teach you photography? And I mean, I could go on, but I
That's
just
easy.
I want to know how he taught you.
Well, first of all, it was all black and white in those days. So there were contact sheets, and everybody was shooting with a 35mm camera, preferably a Leica, and you had 36 exposures on a contact sheet. So all you had to do was sit down with Ernst, and sometimes Cartier-Bresson. Cartier-Bresson was big on that too. And you sat down and you looked at each frame and you marked up with a red crayon the one that you felt was the best. And that was the way you edited.
But did he teach, like, so
No, it
did
was
he
just
teach
by
you what to
looking.
look at,
No.
look for?
No, he didn't. No, I'm
He just,
sorry.
you
You had
watched,
to have,
you watched.
you had to have an affinity for the visual.
Mhm.
I mean, if you were a person that had absolutely no feeling for it,
Right.
then you wouldn't sit down with you to begin with. And I think Kappa somehow, although he was in Paris and I was in New York, had the feeling that I wouldn't be able to grasp a good picture as compared with a bad picture. As a matter of fact, I had been working for the BBC, so everything was sound, nothing was visual. But when I got to Magnum, one of the first jobs I had was to file the photographs which came back from the magazines. So my fun was to look at the picture first and guess whose it was. And
So
then
So he was teaching.
afterwards look on the back and see whether it was by this photographer or that photographer. And that way I developed a sense of the visual, actually, not just knowing whose picture it was, but knowing that it worked. Although I wasn't able to articulate why it worked.
but so that was one of the other, so then he was also then teaching you to look at different photographers' contact sheets differently.
No,
No.
because, well, actually, the contact sheets didn't appear that often. And you really looked at Cartier-Bresson's contact sheets, but you didn't look at some young guy who came in and left his portfolio. And you actually didn't even look at the contact sheets. You just looked at his prints and said, no go. Did I answer you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, I have other, I mean,
Go ahead.
I'm trying to, I mean, I'm trying to imagine that, I'm trying to picture the scene, and so you learn with contact sheets, learn by refiling the photographs that are coming back from the magazines.
Mhm.
Are you looking at photographs elsewhere as part of this education?
Photographs of where?
Are you looking at photographs elsewhere? Are you subscribing to Life magazine? Are you going to MoMA? Where else
No,
are you?
no,
Where
no.
else is this education of photography?
This training
Oh,
of the eye.
Yes, this training of the eye, because
Magazines actually had very little to do with it because most of the time the layout in the magazines were pretty awful. So what you want to do is look at a photographer's photographs, and if possible, after a while you know whose pictures you're looking at without looking on the back to see whose name was on it. So that your education was a sense of intuition and a visual sense rather than anything else. But that's a very important question, how to edit pictures.
You know, I think what surprised me in reading this is also, so Ernst joins Magnum, as Inge said. Actually, he joins 1 year after I was born. So I was sort of placing myself in time because I knew Ernst in the elevator coming in and out of Magnum, but we never really talked about photography. And then he left Magnum. He became a contributor, which was a certain elder status. But I was thinking about when he's president, he's of this community of photographers. And at that point, it's Cartier-Bresson and Werner Bischoff and, you know, the founding generation. And he's highly,
when they saw his contact sheets.
yeah. But I was going to say that he's becomes very critical of his community of photographers. And that I was really struck by that because to me, that's the great challenge. You know, you're in it together, but being in it together, some of what he's doing is challenging. You know, he says, you know, what we had was never craftsmanship, but originality. Today we have learned how to please and to be accepted.
Well,
That
he
is
was
all.
talking about assignments.
I know,
And
exactly.
he was talking about photographers would bring in their work, which they had done on their own, and try and get a reaction from different staff members, see what they went for.
But he's challenging his fellow photographers
Yes, he was very
and
talented.
which continues today to some degree. You know, when he
That's-
says liberate yourselves more from your own repetitions, which you could say to so many photographers today, struggle in your search for your own reality. If everything is in constant change, why not photograph whatever is able to capture everything? In other words, he's challenging, it's not just himself. In every one of us, there is a percentage of the artist. Every one of us wants to take beautiful, striking, extraordinary pictures. Every one of us is struggling with his own style. Changes don't come from pure will alone, willpower alone, but they never come from being satisfied. Let us be more critical with each other. It will bring us closer. Let us find a new common denominator in the struggle not to follow our own standard. Don't cover, discover. You could say that
But-
about any
but he-
field.
That comes
You know?
out, but
Any
he,
field.
well,
Any field.
and that's such a constant too,
Yeah.
because you could fast forward, or not fast forward, sorry, rewind from that point in the
Mm.
book to the earlier moment where the drive to come to the US is to see differently.
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
he actually gives
Yeah.
this beautiful voice to
Yeah.
the desire is to change location in order to push that different visual experience. And
But
so
he-
seeing differently is this, this through line
Mhm.
in,
Mhm.
over decades.
Do you want to read the letter that you liked? I
Since
think
you've got it
'cause
all
I-
marked up.
because
Look at
I-
this.
I
love
couldn't-
this.
Kate and I agreed this was really magical. Really, he's writing to. You can give the context.
Right.
He's-
Right. So one of the other things that I really, so this is, I was thinking of the letter to the uncle when he's talking about seeing differently, but
Oh.
one of the other letters that's
Mm.
from around that same time that I quite liked is, he wrote imaginary letters or letters with imagined recipients, and it seems that they were never mailed, so they were literary exercises. And one of them is conceived as going to the youth of the US, specifically in university. And I think maybe another through line for him is this constant curiosity and this idea that the appropriate recipient of this letter would have to be a university youth.
Yeah.
And so he says, I don't want to make you feel guilty because you are better off and because you are not hungry. Certainly not, but I am envious of you, as I am envious of this letter that I will take to the post office tomorrow, except it's not addressed, so he can't. This letter can then go on its way to a better free world without a passport, without a visa, without an affidavit, without any petition, questionnaire, without standing in line, and so all important, without having to wait. Only censorship, a small formality, causes a few days of delay, and then it will be on its way to the States! Exclamation point. This letter is in place of me, right? His constant longing to go to the States in these immediate post 4 years. More correctly, it is a part of me, and it is traveling to you in my place. It takes the place of my eyes, my ears, my speech. It is my ambassador because it is from you that I hope to hear, hope to see, hope to know.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
No,
I remember one of the things that you first told me not long after we met was just how important it was to put your body somewhere else.
Mm.
I mean, and I think this is
Mm.
linked to what the two
Mm.
of you are talking about, that positioning of your body in a different place is something that also alters the way in which you look at something. It just changes the way in which you perceive something just by putting your body somewhere else. I remember somebody once, Lauren Berlant, who died not too long ago, but who's a literary critic. For her, it was the writing was always about the relation and position of your body in relation to the desk.
Mm,
You know, this is like
Mm.
whatever would come out would change depending on how you were orienting yourself
Mm.
toward the desk. But he talks, I mean, in different places about the movement of the camera. I mean, it's the passage that you cited, but in other
Mhm.
places too. So it's not just that he's putting his body somewhere else, but that camera is also moving as his body is moving.
Yeah. Well, I think there he also reflects on all that movement that also causes him a lot of pain and other people a lot of pain and his family and his kids and the fact that he can't be the person he wants to be artistically and stay still, essentially. And that it's very important for him to move in order to engage, which I think you could, again, speaks to so many of us, you know. So balancing the difficulty of balancing the passion of the work in relation to the people he loved.
That was very difficult.
Yeah.
We haven't talked
Yeah.
about it because she had 2 children and she acted the children. Mother moved to France after they broke up after a while. And then when the kids were about 15, they decided they wanted to be in America and not live in France. And they moved in to an apartment above Ernst's apartment, which was primarily an office, really. And they became, both of them become Americans. They don't stay over there because it was certainly the influence of their father. And very often when he had an assignment to cover a film, for example, he would take the kids along, especially during the summer months, and they would hang around the movie sets, the movie actors.
Inga, maybe we can, I just was thinking, since we're in this setting, there's something which and I think Todd, who's with us here, knows this period of Ernst's life very well when he's teaching in Maine. I think this is sort of interesting for all of you too. He says, even though I teach, I wonder if I should be called a teacher. The word inspirator would be much more to the point. Why? Because I want to bring out what is already within you instead of telling you formulas and theories of how to do it. This you can learn from books or in schools. I don't want to judge results only, but would rather try to feel and understand your intentions. I'm sure that is exactly how he taught. I want you to forget prizes and ribbons, but try first to surprise yourself and then others. Learn to learn, but also to unlearn, to go against the formula and even against the trend. Why do what has already been done? A seminar is different from a school. It's short, concentrated, and should charge you up like a battery. You could just imagine what kind of a teacher he was from that, you know. And I mean, how many photographers do workshops and how many people go to workshops and they dive in for a very intense period. They don't necessarily do a history of photography or get a PhD, et cetera, but they need that kind of recharge. Where am I in what I'm doing? And I just think he must have been amazingly inspiring for people to work with in that period of his life when he allowed himself to go to Maine and take time off. We were talking about traveling versus settling at least for a week to work with younger emerging talent, which he obviously enjoyed.
Of course, Maine was important for him. He went there every summer
Mhm.
for about 15 years.
Yeah.
Because it was also a time where he could be with his children and where he was very interested in getting young people to not get the wrong idea about photography, to encourage them to go and find reflections of themselves.
Yeah.
In the nature.
Yeah.
Around them.
Yeah. It was a television series. No?
Yeah.
Television series. No? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's
yeah.
actually before John Berger, which is
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we should open it up. I mean, you know, this is, I don't know if you've registered what an amazing archive we have here in these three women. So I think you should be able to just ask any kind of question about not just Ernst Haas, but also maybe about the practice, about how you write, I mean, how you put together a book like this, or whatever you want to ask. But I think it's kind of extraordinary to have these three different generations and these three women with us. So yes, yeah, we do have one.
Thanks. Do we know what the people at Life said when they did Ernst Haas's two stories, the color ones? You know, did they leave anything behind, a record of how they felt this was a big change, anything like that? Do we know what was going on in their heads?
I can
Kate,
take that one.
Yeah.
One of the things about doing the project on Life magazine is that I came to have a huge appreciation for how much of the decision making of the kind you're talking about happened conversationally or happened in mock-ups that were then trashed. And so we actually found that only, at least as far as the archivist of 40 years knows, the only extant mock-ups, because everything went away. And so as someone who I think of myself first and foremost as a historian, it was a really hard project because so much was lost. And so there's the way to answer that question is to take a longer view, because we're never going to find the mock-up that didn't run, the lead image that got swapped out, that all apparently has been trashed. And the conversations, the debates around that were not part of the memo apparatus at timing. And so, right, so I have access to like really high level conversations. But what you can do is see the arc of color photography's role in the magazine. And one of the things that happens after his his two-part portfolio, there's a period in the 60s where Life is wanting to give color pride of place. And so the features in Life magazine actually changed over the course of the run of the magazine. But they end up at some point making one of their features the photo essay, right? Like capital T, the photo essay, even though all their stories were photo essays. And very interestingly, in the 60s, there's a period where all the photo essays are in color, and more of them are fairly sort of painterly, are fairly sort of Haas-esque, if you will. And so you can see, if you look at the long arc, you can see that there's this really intense showing of his photographs in 1953, but it doesn't stop there, that there's a kind of ripple effect even into the next decade in the way that the magazine goes on to present color. It's also around the time of the Images of a Magic City that Life starts, like shortly after that, they start consistently doing a color cover. So up until circa 54, 55, they're actually still doing black and white covers, even though they're showcasing color in the magazine. And so I think you can look at these little tells and how they change again, I'll use the phrase pride of place, like where is color getting pride of place? And you see that happening more and more after the Haas two-part portfolio.
When you get into the 70s.
Inge, can you see this photograph? This is New Mexico. Can you you see the photograph that they're seeing? They just asked,
Where
is
is
that New
that?
Mexico? I'd have to look again. It's White Sands?
White Sands.
You know, Kate, it's so interesting because I don't know how many of you are writers or historians or practitioners, but there are two things that make this book really unusual, Inga. One is that Ernst was a writer, not just a photographer. Really, really important, not an assumed. And then that he valued what he was writing and thinking and kept his letters, even those letters that you then traced to the various people he had sent them to, your understanding that the letters he wrote Tunis were really important. He gathered a folder that said autobiography that you recovered when he died. So Inga had a feeling for what to look for. And she worked very closely with Rix Bosma, who's based in Amsterdam, who helped. I mean, she's based in Leiden, actually. But Rix also helped you recontextualize some of the letters, which was very important to do to make them make sense to those of you who will someday read them. So letters on their own have to have a kind of base. What makes your question so interesting to me is I'm very aware in a much later time how little is being kept. And when I meet someone, for example, very similar situation, who published a photograph as a cover of a magazine, when I ask, how did that happen? Either they don't remember, but there's no evidence of the process. So that's what Kate's talking about. So when you're a historian, if you don't have the primary source, in the case of Inga, who, by the way, is 98, and it's rather extraordinary how well you can tell us this life that you've lived alongside of Ernst. So thank you for making an incredible effort for all of us. We're really lucky. But this is living history. And I guess what I want to say to all of you as various kinds of scholars, living history is very, very precious. And we don't value it enough. We don't do enough work in the living part of life to capture. And so letters are in a way easier because they're evidence. Doing the oral histories, digging the way you did for Life magazine, they didn't make it easy for Kate. There weren't files and said, here's our correspondence with the photographers.
Plus, so many of the letters are undated.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, so
Yeah.
so this the effort to try and figure out when they could have been, and I mean, it
Yeah.
requires the kind of personal knowledge that Inga has.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we had such a personal relationship that it was easy. Because for me, it didn't make any difference whether he was there or whether I imagined he was there.
Mm.
Because we'd worked together so closely for so many years.
Yeah.
And he also encouraged me in writing,
Yes.
because the first story I ever did was a story about Ernst. He went up to the editor and called up and said, Inge will write about me. And that was it.
Yeah.
There's a question.
Can you say more about
Do you-
his time?
Hmm?
Can you
Yeah,
say
yeah.
more about his time in Spain?
Or maybe Todd could. Eduardo,
Spain.
Todd here was Ernst's assistant through a lot of the workshop period, and maybe you can respond to that too, Todd.
What are you looking to, just what it was like? Well, he was really the first major photographer to start the main photographic workshop.
Oh, about
In
his time in
Camden,
Maine, yes.
Rockport, Maine is where it was really held, next to Camden. And the first workshop that we did was in '83. It was literally 50 years ago, you know. Usually it was in end of August, and it was pretty special. We'd go up with 20 bags. God knows what was in them. And we would, spend a week with students that would come from all over the country, even out of the country. And it would be all about inspirational critique, similar to what Susan was reading.
Yeah, Todd, hold the mic closer. Inga
It was-
can't
it was
hear you.
Really, most of the workshops were generally around inspirational critiques, meaning, like, for example, you would maybe end up taking more pictures after the workshop, where you would never take another photograph, but you would never feel bad about yourself.
Hmm.
That was pretty critical.
Hmm.
And, I hope that helped in some ways,
Hmm.
you know, it was just,
That's-
no, everything is, nothing more is in Maine. He had a home in Maine, but it's no longer there. The family had taken, you know, sold it. Most of his belongings are here in New York, and at Getty in London. Big archive, but you know, his work is spread out throughout the world. I mean, collections and things like that. Some galleries, yeah, have his, you know, London and Paris. He's got a main gallery in Paris, and Magnum. They show his work in Magnum in Paris. Recently there was a show in Paris with a group of Magnum photographers. I wasn't in Paris for that, but I heard it was quite nice. Did you see it, Susan?
I didn't see it, but
Okay.
you know, one of the things that he actually talks about, and I think was very important for Ernst. I mean, I know this is we've jumped to Life magazine, but actually what Magnum really offered Ernst was not just the assignment to a specific magazine, but this notion of a distribution system. And Magnum's genius in this period of survival for independent photographers, these are people who are not on contract for any magazine. They work by producing the work and distributing the work to multiple territories, which was very important at the time to support we're not talking about the economy that shifts Ernst to more commercial and advertising, which he also talks about in the book. He's very ambivalent and feels the contradiction of that. You know, he's torn between journalism and art and then how to make money. This is a time where there are no galleries.
Well,
you know, he's in MoMA. He's the first color show at MoMA.
First one man color.
First
photography.
color show
Yes,
at MoMA
but
was
it's
paid
not
for
as
by
if he,
the-
but what I'm saying is at that time, there weren't galleries that were then selling edition prints.
No.
Most photographers today live off of a whole different kind of
You
economic
could buy an
structure
Edward Weston for like $35.
at that time.
Yeah.
So what
Edward
I'm
Gibbon.
saying is the distribution system allowed Life to perhaps, with Inge's support, as at the Magnum office, do the first reproduction of the work. But then it might have been published in Germany, in France, in Italy, and other magazines, all of which then would compensate him according to the size of the image and how many pages, which Inge referred to. So that's that. Aside from the assignment, it was the reproduction of work that helped him survive and produce new
But
work.
the photographer also had to have
Yep.
the means.
Yeah.
Photographer had to have the means to produce the story so that he could, on a freelance basis, pay for it himself.
Exactly.
And then you would go to various magazines and sell them. And if
Yeah.
no American magazine would buy it, then some European magazine.
Exactly.
would
So
buy it.
that's
And that was a very unique situation.
yeah. And that is much more difficult, just as an example, in contemporary times because of the internet. Because now if you publish, whether it's Time Magazine or Life, you know, Life isn't publishing in the same way, but the work is seen internationally via the internet. So you don't have these territorial rights that independent photographers used to live from. Just so you understand the whole economic structure.
He was
is different.
also offered a full-time or to be on the
Contract.
staff at Life, which he turned down.
Yes.
I mean, he was, you know, he didn't do it, you know, in a harsh way,
But
but he was
Ernst
just,
unique at Magnum, apart from Cartier-Bresson, who didn't do that many stories. I mean, he did a story on Russia when nobody else went to Russia. And he got paid so much money that he didn't really do anything for magazines for several years.
Yeah.
And that was a unique function of Magnum
Yeah.
because by himself he would never have had the courage to ask for that much money.
Yeah. Yeah. It helped to have a mediator. André. Oh, great.
Not to show color. Was it Elliot? Was it Elliot who showed Elliot Irwood who showed the first color?
No, it's
Barbara is
Elliot
asking.
Porter.
No, it's Elliot
No,
Porter. Elliot
Elliot
Porter has the
Elwood.
first.
Elliot
No,
Porter.
Elliot Porter. It's an exhibit of birds.
Yes.
Ah,
It's
it's Elliot
color,
Porter.
color bird photographs. graced the halls of MoMA as the very first color photography one-person exhibit.
But he wasn't published in magazines.
No, but
Porter did.
among the but Ernst is shown right in that early moment.
Okay.
But I doubt whether Ernst ever saw Porter's work because it was only
Right.
shown at
Right.
MoMA.
Yeah.
before
What
he
did you want to
actually
say, Todd?
arrived.
Todd, we can't hear you.
Porter did show, I mean, first of all, there were other group color photography shows happening, but Porter showed with someone else. It was two-person show.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah, it was.
Thank you.
And it's I just want to make it
And was
clear.
Helen Levitt showing color? And no.
No.
So you're talking about Porter was showing color and Helen Levitt
Right.
was,
I mean, Ernst,
Yeah.
Ernst
But
liked
nobody had the idea of, say, showing, as he did in New York, all the different windows and glasswork.
Mhm.
And nobody had the idea of separating the different elements which made up New York and showing them in pictures. It was a totally new idea.
Mhm,
Mm.
mhm.
Steichen loved it, and Sarkowski hung it.
Well, that helps.
Yeah.
That's all you needed, those two guys.
He got Sarkowski to hang it.
There's another question.
Thank you. Very good. Very interesting. So all your discussion has to do with the art of using the camera and being a good observer. Much of the art of photography, though, occurs in the darkroom, and I wonder if what Ernst had to say about darkroom techniques.
Well, he didn't talk about it, but when he first came to America, he did a series of assignments for Vogue. And he would go and shoot during the day, and then he would go into a darkroom which he had hired and spend all night developing and printing the pictures. But he didn't talk about it very much. But that was before he really got into color.
Mhm.
Can't you? Yes, right. And a couple of others.
Eduardo was. Mhm.
So
Well, somebody asked me to say more about Maine. When Ernst was teaching at Maine, part of the time was when it was really very difficult to get work for photographers, especially young budding photographers. So Ernst would tell them to look into themselves and to photograph what they felt inside, not to fall into the trap of waiting for an assignment. It was very big about not doing assignments, but looking inside, because inside there was always something different for each person, whereas outside it was always the same.
Mhm.
So that White Sands reminds me of O'Keeffe. Was your relationship with Stieglitz?
Well, that was before Stieglitz came out. I mean, Stieglitz came before Ernst arrived in America. I think Stieglitz was already dead when Ernst came. So he didn't really know anything about the history of photography. He knew about Weston when he first got into photography. He'd seen a book in Vienna of Weston's work, and he was very impressed with that. But I don't think he saw any Life magazine time work before he got to England and to America.
I'm glad that you brought up Weston because I think what you've done here, I'm realizing that he was impressed with Weston's photographs, but you've given us Ernst Haas's day books in a way.
Mhm.
So thank you
Mm.
for that,
Thank you.
because I think that that is also, another model or another way in which there's an echo across those two photographers. I think
Yes, there's
And
one
I
more,
think it's
maybe the
very
last one.
important because the magazines are gone and you don't see that kind of photography anymore except in a book
Yeah.
or in an art gallery.
we have one last question.
Thanks. I was thinking a lot about the quote you gave of Ernst where he talks about color photography is more poetic. Which
Could
like
you
on its
speak up, please?
oh yeah, sorry. I was thinking about the quote that Ernst had of color photography being more poetic, which on its own is super, super interesting. But it was making me think or wonder what you all think and what Ernst would have thought, I guess, about digital photography and the way that it kind of is the same cutting edge as color photography would have been at that point, and is new and extending that, but in the same way, there's like a certain poetic feeling to film, I think, that a lot of people, especially now, are returning to.
Well, I think that goes into the business of looking inside yourself, because he was firmly convinced that everybody had a poet inside them. But most people kind of suppress that sort of feeling.
I think that's the beginning of a whole nother conversation. And it's a great one. And I hope you all will have it. I
We
mean,
had it in the beginning too.
in
We
a
had it
way,
in the beginning.
and but I also was thinking, we started looking at the black and white photographs and thinking about his entry into an effect on color photography, as Kate referred to, and others have taken it in other directions. What's also interesting now, be it digital or analog, people going back to black and white is poetic, and the color is every day. And I'm right in the middle of that curve, because when I was doing color photography, it was right at the time where people were expecting it to be black and white. And it was a challenge to say, but why can't it be color? So I was right in the middle of the spectrum we're talking about. I think digital photography is something, a whole new world to have a conversation about at some point. I just wanted to thank you all, because this is really important for Inge. She's worked over 15 years gathering all of these little bits and pieces and fragments. So I want to thank you again, Inge, for
Yeah,
sharing
thank you
with
very
us.
much, Inge.
And for all of you for
Yeah,
coming.
thank you for coming. And
It means a lot.
yeah, thank you. Thank you for
It's not
coming.
just making the book, it's having it have meaning to other people. So thank you. Thank you.
And we
for
have
coming.
copies of the book out here from
Yeah.
Labyrinth. But
It's a
thank you
great read.
again. And
Yeah.
please help me one more round for
Yeah.
these three
Great.
amazing women.
Thank you, Inge.
Thank you, Inge.
Thank you, Inge.
Thank you, Inge.
Thank you, dear.
Oh, I didn't think it was worth
We can't get that
it.
thing where you
Well, and you missed Kate's show.
in an hour and a half. Yeah, why not?
Any chance we could ask one question?
No.